body horror can be very chilling when done right.
There's a scene in the movie Dead Ringers, which sort of marks the end of that period in David Cronenberg's work before he progressed into making films that were less body horror and more psychological thriller, where Jeremy Irons, who plays identical twin gynecologists, are both dating this same woman, and one of them is falling in love with her and the other is not, and their relationship is starting to break up the, shall we say, enormously close bond that the two of them have. And one of them has a nightmare where they are literally Siamese twins that are joined, and this woman that they're dating says, "I'll separate you," and she reaches down to the thing that is connecting the two of them and delicately sinks her teeth into it and pulls something apart. And then the character wakes up freaking out from this thing that's happening, and it's such a perfect encapsulation of the symbolic idea of the thing that is happening to them. And in a film that doesn't really have supernatural elements, is about the process of the characters going mad. It's a perfect metaphor. It's a clean symbol that tells the story of that underlying theme in the film in a single scene. And I think that there's something elegant in terms of the storytelling.
However, like with all films, body horror is not immune to having bad examples. For a taste of not only how unenjoyable body horror can be, but also how it can seem shallow by trying too hard to shock audiences, you need look no further than the Human Centipede trilogy. A trio of films depicting men and women being sewn together into abominations of flesh, in addition to dabbling in racism, torture, rape, abuse, misogyny, and self-indulgence to further disgust viewers. These are films that leave a bad taste in one's mouth after viewing them, especially when compared to better examples of the genre. Though this trilogy is merely a small part of what constitutes the subgenre that is body horror, there are still so many other examples of terror to be witnessed, should you be brave enough to go searching for them. Thirdly, we'll be discussing one of the titans of horror, the classic slasher flick. Slasher horror has been around for many years and serves as perhaps the most recognizable subtype of horror to the vast majority of people. The premises of these movies can typically be boiled down to a simple set of raw elements: a psychopath of murder of some sort, a cast of quirky characters, some very creative murder methods and weapons, and buckets upon buckets of blood. They're all rather simple films at their heart, but slasher films nonetheless seem to have an uncanny ability to attract cult followings. It seems that watching groups of teenagers get butchered by masked men with sharp objects just doesn't get old. When I think of horror, the first face I usually think of is Freddy Krueger, just because when he was first conceptualized and put on film, he had such a unique appearance compared to a lot of other horror characters. He had the iconic sweater, he had the knife glove and the hat and the burns, and he also had a more unique killing style than, Jason or his competitors, because he didn't just hack people up, he came for them in their dreams where they were vulnerable. I think that's why he stuck with me mostly. The majority of famous slasher flicks would develop during the golden age of horror, taking place from 1978 to 1984. This period saw the initial release of several popular slasher flicks, who would later return to the silver screen time and time again to reap the rewards of their successful franchises. 1978 saw the release of the genre-defining film Halloween, directed by John Carpenter. This movie tells the tale of Michael Myers, a mentally deranged murderer who stalks and slays a group of youth on Halloween night. Not only was this film scary in and of itself, but also served to help influence genre tropes heavily. Hot off the heels of Halloween came the original Friday the 13th in 1980, which would usher in the coming of one of horror's most prominent idols, Jason Voorhees. Yet another was born near the end of the golden age of horror with A Nightmare on Elm Street, which brought to life the horribly disfigured, knife-handed nightmare stalker named Freddy Krueger. Usually I think it's because they're recognizable. People will look at horror idols and they'll see someone that they know and that they fear because they've seen them enough times. It's like how people look at actors and go see movies because of that. They see a horror idol and they think, I know what I'm in for, I know that this horror idol scares me, so I want to go see this because it's going to scare me and I'll enjoy it. There was a decline in the popularity of slasher flicks following the golden age of horror, but a revival came in 1996 with the release of Wes Craven's film Scream. This flick gained popularity by mocking the established tropes of horror during its runtime, even going so far as to attempt to subvert them altogether in order to make the experience of viewing it more unique. With new life breathed into the genre, several new movies began to emerge, and horror seemed to be regarded once again as popular and exciting. Slasher flicks can be seen even to this day, truly a testament to the influence and staying power that they have had in the medium, although it can be said that no film since the Golden Age have truly been able to recapture the original fear that this type of film brought audiences.
Typically, when one thinks of horror, this particular subgenre gets overlooked. It's not your generic horror movie, but a combination of fear-inducing horror and breathtaking dramatic scenarios. These movies generally incorporate fear interlocked with the characters' personal crises, creating a very realistic look into the characters' personal lives and daily struggles, slowly incorporating the horror aspect, weaving a realistic, character-driven, bone-chilling narrative. Generally, horror dramas rely more on the psychological aspect of horror, focusing on the characters' emotions and mental health, and how the events of the movie wear down their mental stability, usually ending with a previously normal person left bumbling and insane, or dead.
It's fun, I guess. Adrenaline. Plot lines are kind of interesting, and adrenaline rushes are fun.
In horror dramas, the mortality rate of the protagonist is actually not very high. The protagonists usually end up surviving the length of the movie, though they rarely come out unscathed. They may be in some cases physically unharmed, though the likelihood of that is slim, but they will almost definitely be mentally or psychologically scarred in many ways, from having to witness terrifying and brutal images, to actually having to commit one or multiple murders for their own survival. The end result is not appealing in the slightest, almost always leaving you sympathizing for the protagonist. The movie Hush is an excellent example. Hush is about a reclusive deaf author who lives alone and is confronted by a deranged serial killer after he murders her neighbor for fun. The killer notices her, and realizing she's deaf, proceeds to gain her attention and torment her by attempting to break in and murder her, with the thought that she'd be an easy target. He runs into trouble when she starts to fight back, and proves to be a formidable opponent even with her disability. After a night of him trying to kill her in multiple ways, both having received multiple wounds, the ongoing game of cat and mouse ends with them struggling on the ground, both bloodied and beaten. The protagonist manages to grab a corkscrew and drive it through his throat, ending her night of suffering and torment.
The first one was good. The ending twist was neat.
Another good example of a horror drama would be the film Orphan, where a recovering alcoholic mother with 2 children goes out to adopt a 3rd child from an orphanage. Throughout the movie, the orphan, Esther, reveals her true nature, that she is in fact not an innocent child that she seems to be, but is actually a 33-year-old woman who suffers from a hormone disorder that stunted her physical growth. She has spent most of her life posing as a little girl, having people adopt her with the goal of seducing the father and having a sexual relationship with him, murdering them and their families if the father refused. After the father rejects her sexual advances, she flies into a homicidal rage, murdering him and going after the mother and her children. But in the end, she fails due to the mother's determination to save her children, and she snaps Esther's neck in the process of saving her daughter. Lastly, we'd like to make something very, very clear. Horror doesn't always have to be taken seriously. Mocking tropes and subverting trends is not at all uncommon within the genre as a whole, but at its heart, it isn't hard to make a horror film entertaining in ways that don't involve eviscerating bands of dumbass teenagers, or satiating the audience's desire for some hardcore torture porn. Enter comedy horror. Scary films with a sense of humor, self-aware flicks that can make audiences laugh and scream in equal measure if made correctly. Well, personally, I find that horror movies without at least a little bit of humor are kind of dull and bland. Like, if it's just a horror movie where it's just jump scare after jump scare and, creepy scene after creepy scene, it gets kind of just tedious and boring. So it's nice to kind of splice it up with a few jokes here and there.
There truly is a wide selection of examples when it comes to comedy horror. A perfect encapsulation of the subgenre and a recognizable example can be seen in Shaun of the Dead, the classic British film about a band of friends who try to survive the dangers of the encroaching zombie apocalypse. Its blending of well-done comedy and heart-wrenching moments make it quite a trip to view, and it's no small wonder that it has gathered a cult following since its release. Evil Dead 2 can also be seen as a notable comedy horror film, even though it may not have even been intended to be seen as one. The timeless tale of Ash Williams' struggle against the vile forces known as the Deadites, while bearing some rather disturbing themes, comes as such an over-the-top package that is very difficult to take it even a little bit seriously. Or if you're looking for a comedy horror film that puts far more emphasis on the pursuit of making the audience laugh than evacuate their bowels, look no further than Return of the Killer Tomatoes, a movie in which a mad scientist finds a way to make evil tomatoes into people. And before you ask, yes, that is a real film. When you step back and realize it shares traits with many other classic monster movies as well, the experience of witnessing it almost seems to become even more laughable.
I don't think it feels natural to be amused and afraid at the same time, but I feel like that's kind of what makes horror comedy such a unique genre, is they find two complete opposite emotions that you can just put together and still somehow make it good and entertaining, that I find that it seems to be actually a quite good match for each other, even though generally they are not two good emotions to put together. However, perhaps the greatest example of a film that seamlessly blends subverting of tropes, hilarious jokes, and legitimate horror can be seen in Cabin in the Woods, the 2012 directorial debut by Drew Goddard. This film brilliantly marketed itself as another classic slasher flick, drawing in typical crowds of scare junkies, eager to witness what chills and thrills in this latest addition to the genre. However, the film managed to expose and avoid a number of cliches throughout its runtime, even going so far as to present a massive twist near the end of the movie. Until this secret is revealed, however, Cabin in the Woods still shines as a well-made example of its medium. There's enough blood and violence to satiate most horror fanatics, but enough comedy to entertain almost anybody willing to sit through its runtime. Plus, the underlying plot gives the thinking man something to enjoy as well. While comedy horror may not be the most horrifying of its kind to ever grace the silver screen, there are a few subgenres that so perfectly blend two types of film together to create such entertaining flicks.
As we said before, these are just a few examples of horror subgenres, and there are still many other things that can be said about the genre as a whole. In fact, horror is still developing further and further as time goes on. With the advent of virtual reality technologies such as the Oculus Rift, more interactive horror films could already be in development, putting you right in the thick of the action. First-person horror truly would do wonders for the genre, but now, all we can do is wait and see what comes next. And until then, there's a hell of a lot of horror films that need watching, even if a lot of them are garbage.